I still remember the way the room fell silent when the executor unfolded the papers. A long mahogany table divided us, but the real gulf was much older, years of strain, resentment, and whispered judgments. My stepbrother, Aaron, leaned back in his chair with the smugness of a man who believed the world was already arranged in his favor. He hadn't even tried to hide his smirk when I walked in. He'd already told me, twice, that I didn't need to be there. "No one even mentioned you, Margaret," he said earlier that morning, standing in the hallway outside the law office. "This is mostly procedural. You can go home. Honestly, it'll be less awkward for both of us." It was astonishing how confidently people could rewrite history when it suited them. He spoke with the ease of someone rehearsing a line, convinced of his own story. But I didn't leave. There was something in the way he said it, too smooth, too practiced. And I had spent my entire life listening for the subtle notes that other people ignored. At 70, I trusted my instincts more than I trusted the assurances of a man who had never once told the truth when a lie could get him further. So I sat at that table, hands folded, heartbeat steady, waiting. The executor cleared his throat. He was a small man with narrow shoulders but a voice that carried like polished steel. He lifted the first page of my stepfather's will, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. The first words out of his mouth were my name. "This estate is to be executed with primary advisement from Margaret Delaney." The room shifted. It wasn't physical, but I felt it, like pressure dropping before a storm. Aaron jerked upright. "What?" The executor continued calmly, as though Aaron's confusion was expected. "And significant portions of the estate, financial, residential, and liquid, shall transfer to her upon confirmation of inventory." My name again. Sentence after sentence. I didn't smile. Not once. But inside, I felt a quiet tremor, the kind that comes before truth finally breaks through a long winter of lies. Aaron slammed his hand on the table. "This has to be a mistake. My father and I discussed everything before he passed. He would have told me if." The executor held up a hand. "Mr. Delaney, these documents were updated 6 months ago. Your father signed them in our office. Witnessed. Notarized. Final. 6 months ago. 6 months before he died. 6 months during which Aaron had convinced himself he already owned everything he touched." I looked at him, really looked, at the panic beginning to hollow his eyes, at the disbelief spreading like cracks across a porcelain mask. This wasn't triumph. Not yet. I didn't even know what my stepfather had left, or why he'd made those choices. All I knew was that the story Aaron had written for himself was unraveling thread by thread, and he had no idea how much more was waiting to come undone. The executor placed a sealed envelope in front of me. "Mrs. Delaney, your stepfather left a personal letter for you. He requested it be read privately before any further decisions were made." A letter. Addressed only to me. Aaron's chair screeched as he stood. "This is ridiculous. I want a recount, an audit, something. She has no standing here." But the executor's reply was final. "She has more standing than you think." And in that moment, I knew, this wasn't just a will. This was the beginning of a truth my stepbrother had worked very hard to bury. I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. I had no idea that what waited inside would dismantle everything I thought I knew about my family, and ignite the quiet, devastating revenge that would follow. My name is Margaret Delaney, and I am 70 years old. 70 doesn't feel the way it looks from a distance. People imagine frailty, a softening of ambition, a retreat from the world. But those who survive long enough learn a different truth: age compresses life into clearer shapes. The noise falls away. What remains is intention, memory, and a steadiness one cannot fake. I was not always this composed. I spent decades performing quietness so others could feel louder, shrinking myself so conflict could slip past without catching on me. I grew up in a household where secrets were treated like heirlooms, handled delicately, never discussed, and always passed down. By the time I reached adulthood, I could read silence as fluently as language. I met my stepfather, Thomas Delaney, when I was 49 and newly widowed. I had loved my husband deeply, but grief has a way of hollowing a person until they no longer recognize the shape of their own life. Thomas entered my world gently, like someone approaching a frightened animal in the woods, slow enough not to startle, but firm enough not to vanish into the trees. He was kind, patient, and deliberate in ways I didn't know how to trust at first. His son, Aaron, was already grown then, mid-20s, polished, ambitious, and unmistakably aware of his effect on people. He treated me with polite distance, the kind reserved for a substitute teacher or a temporary manager. I convinced myself he simply needed time. I gave him years of it. Thomas and I married after 2 years of companionship and quiet dinners and the soft relief of shared silence. He never tried to replace what I'd lost. Instead, he made room for it, allowing my grief to sit at the table without demanding it leave. Even after his passing, I still found myself setting out 2 plates sometimes, only to stop halfway and gently return one to the cabinet. Old habits remain long after purpose fades. Before the will reading, I lived simply. I kept a tidy garden, baked bread on Sundays, and spent afternoons teaching literacy courses at the community center. I had a life with routines, small joys, and few expectations. I never wanted wealth or power or anyone's approval. Peace was enough. But peace, I've learned, is often the first thing threatened when someone else feels entitled to more than their share. Aaron had always assumed he would inherit everything the moment his father's heart stilled. He never said it directly, people like him rarely do, but entitlement has a scent, and he wore it like cologne. I didn't fight him for closeness. I didn't push for affection. I simply existed in the space between him and his father, grateful for the companionship I had found but never seeking to replace the bond they shared. Which is why the will, the letter, the very fact that my name appeared before his, left me unsettled. Confused. Curious. I wasn't angry yet. That emotion would come later, after the truth began to surface in sharp, unexpected fragments. At that moment in the law office, all I knew was that a man I loved had left something for me. Something private. Something he didn't trust anyone else to explain. And for the first time in months, I felt the faintest tremor of unease ripple beneath the calm surface of my life. When I finally opened the letter that evening, sitting alone at my kitchen table, the first sentence nearly made me drop the page. It contained a warning, one I never imagined would involve my own family. Families rarely fracture all at once. They split in hairline cracks first, quiet disappointments, unspoken resentments, moments that pass unnoticed until years later when you finally understand what they meant. Looking back, I can see exactly where those cracks began with Aaron, though at the time I dismissed each one as harmless, as something that would soften with maturity. My stepfather, Thomas, adored his son. That love was unmistakable. But adoration can sometimes blind even the most sensible heart. He saw Aaron as driven, confident, self-assured. I saw what Thomas didn't have the strength to confront, a restlessness, almost a hunger, that never seemed satisfied. Aaron's ambition wasn't the quiet kind that worked hard and waited its turn. His moved like wildfire, beautiful at a distance, destructive up close. When I first married Thomas, I tried to approach Aaron with gentleness. I reminded myself that he hadn't chosen me, that his father's remarriage might have felt like a shift in gravity. I made efforts, small ones, respectful ones. I invited him to dinner, asked about his work, remembered his birthday every year. When he showed up, which wasn't often, he behaved like a guest performing politeness rather than family sharing a meal. He always called me Margaret. Never Maggie, the name my late husband used, and never Mom, not that I expected it. But the way he said my name sometimes felt like he was putting it in quotation marks, as though my very presence came with footnotes. What I found more revealing than his words was the way he responded to Thomas. He often treated his father with a mixture of charm and impatience, like someone trying to persuade a client who wasn't moving fast enough. He praised Thomas's wisdom while quietly assuming he could handle things better himself. And Thomas, God bless him, saw only confidence in those moments, not manipulation. Their bond was complicated, and I never interfered. Children, even adult ones, hold power over their parents in ways no outsider can untangle. I watched the dynamics with a softness that came from experience. My own daughter had passed away years before, a loss too deep to shape into words. Parenthood had taught me how fiercely the heart clings to love, even imperfect love. So I never judged Thomas for wanting to believe the best of his son. But Aaron's resentment toward me had a shape, a shadow. It was subtle at first. He spoke over me at family gatherings. He changed plans without including me. He made decisions about his father's healthcare near the end that he felt obliged to explain, as if I were a distant relative instead of a wife navigating grief in real time. Still, Thomas never saw these small steals, of attention, of authority, of affection. He loved us both, and he tried to keep peace. I learned to let certain moments pass, not because I was weak, but because I understood what battles cost. Yet after Thomas died, the veneer cracked. Aaron's calls became transactional. His condolences sounded rehearsed. And when he told me not to bother showing up to the will reading, it was not the first time he had tried to erase me, only the first time he said it plainly. But the letter Thomas left for me carried truth he had never spoken aloud. And that truth, held in thin white pages on my kitchen table, explained exactly why Aaron had been growing more dismissive, more territorial, more confident that the world, and his father's estate, belonged entirely to him. The letter did more than warn me, it revealed a secret Thomas had discovered about his son, a secret that would turn the quiet cracks in our family into a fault line. The letter trembled slightly in my hands as I read it, not because of fear, but because of the weight of a confession Thomas had carried alone. His handwriting, always neat and angled, ran steady through the page. He addressed me as, "My dear Margaret," a gentleness that brought a sudden sting to my eyes. But the warmth of those first lines dissolved quickly as he shifted into the truth he had been too ashamed to speak while alive. He wrote that 6 months before his death, the same time the will was updated, he discovered irregularities in one of his investment accounts. It was an account he rarely touched, a modest nest egg meant for emergencies or unexpected healthcare needs. When he noticed funds missing, he assumed it was a bank error. But when he asked for statements, the pattern became clear: small withdrawals at first, almost invisible, then larger ones, spaced methodically, as if whoever took them believed patience would conceal the theft. It wasn't the bank. It wasn't an error. It was Aaron. Thomas didn't want to believe it. The letter made that heartbreakingly clear. He wrote that he spent weeks searching for another explanation: identity theft, miscommunication, clerical mistakes. He even confronted the bank manager, insisting they review security footage before accusing his own son. But the evidence left no room for doubt: documents signed in Aaron's distinctive slanted script, digital authorizations traced to his devices, and a quiet transfer of funds into one of Aaron's personal accounts. "I wanted to tell you sooner," Thomas wrote, "but I could not bear the shame." He couldn't face the reality that the son he'd poured his hopes into had stolen from him while he was alive and growing weaker each month. Worse still, Thomas discovered that Aaron had taken out a private loan in his father's name, tens of thousands of dollars, using forged signatures. The debt hadn't been repaid. It was sitting like a coiled snake beneath the surface, poised to strike once the estate settled. Thomas didn't want that burden falling on me. His will revisions were an attempt to protect me from consequences I knew nothing about. But there was something else, something that made my breath catch. He revealed that Aaron had been pressuring him for access to the house deed, claiming it was for estate efficiency. Thomas refused. Days later, documents arrived in the mail requesting his signature for a deed transfer, documents Thomas had never asked for. He suspected Aaron had prepared them, hoping his father's failing memory or worsening fatigue would make him sign without scrutiny. That was the moment Thomas realized his son had crossed a threshold he could not ignore. "I loved him," he wrote, "but love cannot excuse harm. I have hidden his actions to protect my pride. But now, I must protect you." The words felt heavy on the page, heavier still in my chest. It wasn't just theft. It was betrayal shaped in months-long increments, smooth and calculated. Aaron had stolen from his father while the man was dying, then attempted to orchestrate a future in which he could quietly take the rest. By the time I finished the letter, one truth pulsed clear and cold: Aaron hadn't merely dismissed me at the will reading. He had been expecting a victory that required my absence. And Thomas, anticipating all of it, had placed a different future in motion. I folded the letter slowly, knowing this was only the beginning. If Thomas had found evidence, perhaps more existed, more than Aaron ever imagined anyone else would uncover. The morning after reading the letter, I brewed a pot of tea I never drank. My hands moved through the motions: kettle, leaves, water, cup, while my mind combed through the details Thomas had given me. Grief had turned into something sharper overnight. Not anger yet, but clarity. A painful, necessary kind. If Thomas had uncovered evidence, then that evidence had to exist somewhere outside his private thoughts. He had been meticulous all his life, a man who kept receipts from 30 years ago zipped in tidy envelopes, labeled with date and intent. So I began where he would have begun, his study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, a scent I had always found comforting. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found exactly what I suspected: folders arranged chronologically, each marked with handwritten tabs. It didn't take long to find the one with a newer label: darker ink, AD, Concerns. AD for Aaron Delaney. Inside were copies of withdrawal slips, printed screenshots of online banking activity, a notarized statement from the bank acknowledging suspicious authorization logs, and a letter from their fraud department requesting confirmation of disputed transfers. Thomas had written notes in the margins: calculations, dates, circled discrepancies. He had been gathering evidence quietly, carefully, like someone assembling a case he hoped never to use. I sat in his leather chair, the folder open across my lap, and felt the slow, steady shift inside myself, the transition from ignorance to understanding, from passive widow to informed executor. It was the same feeling I'd had years ago working as a community advocate, helping women organize documentation during legal disputes. There was a rhythm to truth when you followed it patiently. It always led somewhere honest. By noon, I had organized everything into sections: withdrawals, forged loan documents, attempted deed transfer, and correspondence. Each piece fit together like an uncomfortable puzzle. But I needed a professional, someone who could look beyond emotion and into legality. So I called an attorney I trusted, a woman named Elise Vargas, who had once represented a friend through a painful probate dispute. Elise had the rare combination of warmth and precision, and she answered her own phone. When I explained, in calm but deliberate sentences, what I had found, she grew quiet. "Margaret," she said after a moment, "this is not only civil fraud. Depending on the specifics, some of this could fall under criminal statutes." "I assumed as much," I replied. "But I'm not looking to destroy him, Elise. I'm looking to understand the scope. And to protect what Thomas wanted protected." She told me to bring everything to her office. That afternoon, we spread the documents across her conference table. She moved through them carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she cross-referenced dates and signatures. When she finished, she let out a slow breath. "This is significant," she said. "Your stepfather documented nearly everything a court would need. It's methodical. He was preparing for confrontation." I nodded, feeling both pride in Thomas's foresight and sorrow that he bore this alone. "There's something else," Elise added, sliding forward a document I hadn't fully understood. "This loan, taken in your stepfather's name, is still outstanding. If Aaron is the borrower and the estate is the guarantor, the liability could fall onto you as executor unless we intervene." "And if we intervene?" I asked. Her expression sharpened. "Then we follow the evidence. Quietly. Legally. And we ensure the estate is shielded before Aaron realizes you know." For the first time in days, I felt anchored. Grounded. In possession of a truth Aaron had hoped would remain buried. But Elise wasn't finished. She had uncovered something else, something Thomas hadn't known. And once she explained it, I realized Aaron's betrayal was only half the story. Elise waited until I had settled back into my chair before she spoke again. The room, usually bright with afternoon sun, felt quieter than usual, thick with the weight of what she'd just discovered. She tapped her finger gently on a page I hadn't noticed earlier, a summary of financial activity connected to the forged loan. "Margaret," she said, "your stepfather didn't know this part. The lender attempted to contact him several times in the months before his death. When they didn't receive a response, they escalated the file. That triggered an internal review." She paused, letting me follow the logic. The review uncovered a second loan application. One Thomas never saw. One Aaron never completed. I leaned forward. Why didn't he complete it? Because the lender flagged the signature as suspicious and froze the application. Elise exhaled slowly. He tried to borrow more, much more, but was stopped before the funds were approved. The implications settled heavily between us. The theft wasn't a momentary lapse or a desperate misjudgment. It was a pattern. A plan. A long game Aaron believed he could play without consequence. I felt a shift inside me, not loud, not dramatic. Something quieter, firmer. A decision forming like a stone at the bottom of a river. For months after Thomas's death, I had allowed grief to soften the edges of my perceptions. I had given Aaron the benefit of every doubt, even when he offered none in return. But the evidence, spread across Elisa's table like a map of concealed intentions, stripped away any remaining illusions. "Do you believe he'll try again?" I asked. Elise nodded. "Yes. Especially once he realizes the estate doesn't reflect the financial picture he expected. Men who do this rarely stop unless confronted or exposed." "Exposed," I repeated softly. I looked down at Thomas's folder, his precise handwriting, his careful annotations. He had given me the tools even in his absence. He had trusted me to protect the truth he hadn't had the strength to face publicly. My hands folded together, steady as stone. "Then we expose him. But we do it quietly, legally, and without cruelty." Elise gave a small smile. "You want accountability, not vengeance." "I want integrity," I said. "Thomas deserved that. And so do I." The plan began simply. Elise would file a protective executor's notice that froze the estate's financial distributions until a review of liabilities was complete. Aaron would receive the notification, but not the specifics. That would buy us time. Next, she would contact the lender through formal channels, declaring the estate's intent to dispute any debt incurred through forgery. Parallel to that, she recommended hiring a forensic document analyst to authenticate signatures, though we both knew what the results would be. But the turning point for me wasn't legal strategy. It came later that evening, long after I returned home. I sat in Thomas's study again, the same letter open beside me. The house felt painfully still, settling as old homes do when the day cools. I rested a hand on the desk, on the place where Thomas had once written his notes. "I promise," I whispered aloud, not to the room, but to him, "I won't let him harm anyone else. Not through deceit. Not through silence." For the first time since his passing, my grief aligned itself with purpose. The sorrow no longer hollowed me, it fortified me. And that was the moment Aaron lost the advantage he never knew he held. Because the very next day, he made a bold move, one that revealed he sensed something slipping through his fingers, and one that told me he was preparing his own version of the truth. Aaron called me early the next morning, his voice bright with a forced cheerfulness that put every nerve in me on alert. He was performing confidence again, something he did whenever he sensed a shift he could not yet identify. "Margaret," he said, stretching my name into a shape meant to sound warm, "I think we should get together. Talk through some estate details, just to make everything smooth." Smooth. A word he used often when he wanted something concealed. "I've already begun the executor's preliminary review," I replied evenly. "There will be updates in due time." There was a pause, too long to be casual. "Executor's review?" he repeated. "What kind of review?" The standard kind, I said. The kind that ensures transparency. He exhaled a tight laugh. Well, I'm sure that's necessary, but I'd prefer to be involved. After all, Dad and I discussed. He stopped. I let the silence sit between us. We'll speak when there's something worth speaking about, I said, then ended the call. That was the moment the facade cracked. By midday, Elise forwarded me 3 emails Aaron had sent her, aggressive, defensive, and increasingly frantic. He demanded updates on the estate's financials, insisted he held primary familial authority, and suggested delaying any reviews until he could oversee them personally. Elise responded with the professionalism of a surgeon. Precise. Cold. Unshakable. She reiterated that all estate actions were proceeding according to statute and that any interference would be noted. Later that week, the lender formally acknowledged our fraud dispute. Attached to their message were authentication results from preliminary signature analysis, results that contradicted every claim Aaron would later try to make. Elise quietly filed a notice of potential criminal misconduct, not as an accusation, but as a protective measure should the lender escalate. None of this was visible to Aaron yet. The beauty, and the weight, of ethical revenge is that it unfolds without spectacle. It doesn't shout. It simply reveals. The true consequence arrived in increments. First, the estate freeze meant Aaron could not access a single asset, not the accounts, not the house, not even the car he had assumed would be his. The man who lived on projection, the tailored suits, the expensive watch, the curated social circle, began unraveling without the financial foundation he'd counted on. Next came the lender's escalation. They contacted him directly, requesting documentation to verify the forged loan's legitimacy. Elise received a panicked voicemail from him that afternoon, demanding she correct the misunderstanding. She didn't respond. Then came the part no one could protect him from. His employer learned of the financial investigation when they were contacted to verify his income. A quiet inquiry, standard procedure. But in Aaron's industry, financial management, reputational fractures spread quickly. Within a week, he was placed on leave pending review of compliance concerns. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was simply the quiet collapse of a man who had built his life on borrowed structure. The final consequence unfolded during a scheduled meeting Elise arranged, one Aaron believed was a negotiation. He arrived tense but smiling, carrying a folder as if performing competence. Elise and I waited in a modest conference room. When she presented the compiled evidence, withdrawals, forged signatures, attempted deed transfer, Aaron went absolutely still. Not angry. Not defiant. Just hollowed. The mask fell because there was nothing left beneath it strong enough to hold. This can proceed privately, Elise said, or through formal channels. That is your choice. Aaron opened his mouth, then closed it. He stared at the documents, at the proof his father had assembled, at the truth he could no longer outrun. I didn't think he'd notice, he whispered. And that was the moment I understood the real tragedy. He hadn't thought anyone who loved him would ever hold him accountable. The meeting ended quietly, but what followed reshaped the remains of our family. Because accountability is one thing. Aftermath is another. In the weeks that followed the meeting, the air around me felt strangely lighter, not triumphant, not victorious, just quietly unburdened. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after living for too long inside someone else's shadow, and another that follows stepping out of it. I felt both at once. My days returned to their rhythms, morning walks, tending my garden, visiting the community center. Yet even in the smallest tasks, something in me had shifted. I was no longer moving through life with a reflexive softness meant to keep peace. I was moving with intention. Aaron remained silent. Not a call. Not an email. Elise informed me that he had chosen the private route, signing agreements that released the estate from all liability in exchange for sealing the documentation of his misconduct. The forged loan became his alone to face. The missing funds were recorded as debts owed, to be repaid under monitored terms. And the attempt to alter the deed, though never completed, was formally acknowledged. He would not gain control of the house. He would not touch the accounts. The estate remained secure. But none of that brought me satisfaction. Not in the way strangers imagine justice must feel. What settled inside me instead was something closer to grief, or perhaps recognition. Accountability has a way of showing you the true shape of what was lost long before the truth surfaced. Aaron and I had never truly been family, not in the sense of mutual regard or shared trust. But Thomas had believed in the possibility of it, and that belief had once meant something to me. Losing that possibility stung in a subtle but persistent way. One afternoon, I visited Thomas's grave. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind where even the breeze seems reluctant to disturb the world. I brought a small arrangement of lilies from my garden. He always preferred lilies to roses. As I placed them down, I felt the familiar ache of missing him, softened only by the knowledge that I had carried out what he could not. I spoke aloud in the stillness, a habit that had grown easier with time. "I did what you asked, my love," I said. "Not out of anger. Out of duty. And out of respect." The wind lifted slightly, brushing the leaves above. It felt like the closest thing to approval I would ever receive. I sat with him for a while, letting the quiet settle. I didn't tell him everything. Some truths belong more to the living than the dead, but I told him enough. Enough to let go of the tension that had wrapped itself around my heart since the day of the will reading. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox, forwarded from the attorney's office. It was from Aaron. The handwriting alone told me he had struggled to write it. The lines were uneven, the ink darker in places where the pen had paused too long. I didn't open it right away. I brewed tea first, sat at the kitchen table, and allowed myself a moment to breathe. When I finally unfolded the page, the letter was short. Apologetic in a muted, almost formal way. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He simply acknowledged what he had done and admitted that he had underestimated both his father's clarity and my resolve. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was the first honest thing he had ever given me. I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where I kept Thomas's. Not beside it, separate, but near. A reminder that closure rarely comes in neat shapes, but it does come. And as I closed the drawer, I realized there was one final truth I needed to share, one last piece of wisdom Thomas's legacy had given me, which shaped the way this story truly ends. In the weeks after everything settled, I found myself returning to the small rituals of my days with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Grief still lived in the quiet corners of the house, but it no longer clung to me. It moved gently, like a memory that had learned to respect its boundaries. And in that softened space, a lesson began to take shape, one I understood more fully each morning as I stepped into the garden or stirred a pot of soup or simply sat in the silence Thomas and I once shared so comfortably. People imagine that revenge is a sharp thing, a blade meant to cut swiftly and leave a clean edge. But real justice, the ethical kind, the quiet kind, rarely looks like that. It is not loud. It is not triumphant. It does not declare itself to the world. It simply reveals what was already true and allows consequences to follow their own path. I learned that the most powerful reckonings do not require raised voices or shattered relationships. They require clarity, documentation, and the courage to stop protecting the stories others want you to believe. When I looked back on everything that happened, the theft, the lies, the unraveling, I realized something I had never allowed myself to name. I had spent years accommodating Aaron's small dismissals, believing grace meant stepping aside. But grace is not the absence of boundaries. It is the quiet confidence to hold them without apology. Thomas had spent a lifetime excusing his son's failings out of love, and though I understand the impulse, I now see the cost of such forgiveness when it is not paired with accountability. I do not resent Aaron. Resentment would bind me to him more tightly than any legal entanglement ever could. Instead, I hold him with a kind of distant compassion, the understanding that some people mistake proximity for entitlement and kindness for weakness. He learned too late that neither assumption was true. What stays with me most is something Thomas wrote in his letter, in a line I returned to many times after the dust settled. Protecting the truth, he said, is not an act of aggression. It is an act of love, for oneself, and for the life one hopes to leave behind. At 70, I find the truth of that sentence more profound than any closing argument or legal victory. The legacy he left me was not money, nor the house, nor the authority of executor. It was the reminder that dignity is something one must choose, especially when others try to rewrite your place in their lives. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit in the study with the window cracked open, listening to the soft rustle of the trees outside. I imagine Thomas sitting across from me, reading or sipping his tea, and I tell him, quietly, without ceremony, that I kept my promise. I did not seek to ruin his son. I sought only to stop the harm. And in doing so, I reclaimed parts of myself I didn't realize I had been giving away. If there is a moral to this story, it is this: when someone tells you that you don't matter, do not argue. Do not plead. Simply proceed with the truth. The truth has a way of introducing you, calmly, unmistakably, in rooms where others tried to erase your name. And if you ever find yourself standing at a table where someone insists you don't belong, remember this as well: you do not need their acknowledgement to stand. You only need your own steadiness, your own evidence, your own voice. The executor began the meeting with my name. Not because I demanded it, but because the truth, quiet, patient, and unwavering, had already made room for me.